Whenever any of the natives or Hans tried to inform me, I bade them hold their tongues. Epilogue. I have little more to add to this record, which I fear has grown into quite a long book, or at any rate, although the setting of it down has amused me during the afternoons and evenings of this endless English winter, now that the spring has come again I seem to have grown weary of writing. Therefore I shall leave what remains untold to the imagination of anyone who chances to read these pages. We were victorious, and had indeed much cause for gratitude who still lived to look upon the sun. Yet the night that followed the Battle of the Gate was a sad one, at least for me, who felt the death of my friend, the foresighted hero Mavovo, of the bombastic but faithful Sammy, and of my brave hunters more than I can say. Also the old Zulu's prophecy concerning me, that I too should die in battle, weighed upon me, who seemed to have seen enough of such ends in recent days and to desire one more tranquil. Living here in peaceful England as I do now, with no present prospect of leaving it, it does not appear likely that it will be fulfilled. Yet, after my experience of the divining powers of Mavovo's snake, well, those words of his make me feel uncomfortable, for when all is said and done, who can know the future? Moreover, it is the improbable that generally happens. As the readers of Allan Quatermain will be aware, this prophecy of the dying Zulu was fulfilled. Mr. Quatermain died at Zuvendis as a result of the wound he received in the battle between the armies of the rival queens. Editor. Further, the climatic conditions were not conducive to cheerfulness, for shortly after sunset it began to rain and poured for most of the night, which, as we had little shelter, was inconvenient both to us and to all the hundreds of the homeless Mazitu. However, the rain ceased in due time, and on the following morning the welcome sun shone out a clear sky. When we had dried and warmed ourselves a little in its rays, someone suggested that we should visit the burned-out town where, except for some smouldering heaps that had been huts, the fire was extinguished by the heavy rain. More from curiosity than for any other reason I consented, and accompanied by Bausi, Babemba and many of the Mazitu, all of us, except Brother John, who remained behind to attend to the wounded, climbed over the debris of the south gate and walked through the black ruins of the huts, across the market-place that was strewn with dead, to what had been our quarters. These were a melancholy sight, a mere heap of sodden and still smoking ashes. I could have wept when I looked at them, thinking of all the trade goods and stores that were consumed beneath, necessities for the most part, the destruction of which must make our return journey one of great hardship. Well, there was nothing to be said or done, so after a few minutes of contemplation we turned to continue our walk through what had been the royal quarters to the north gate. Hans, who, I noted, had been ferreting about in his furtive way as though he were looking for something, and I were the last to leave. Suddenly he laid his hand upon my arm and said, "Baas, listen, I hear a ghost. I think it is the ghost of Sammy asking us to bury him." "Bosh!" I answered, and then listened as hard as I could. Now I also seemed to hear something coming from I knew not where, words which were frequently repeated and which seemed to be, "Oh, Mr. Quatermain, I beg you to be so good as to open the door of this oven." For a while I thought I must be cracked. However, I called back the others and we all listened. Of a sudden Hans made a pounce, like a terrier does at the run of a mole that he hears working underground, and began to drag, or rather to shovel, at a heap of ashes in front of us, using a bit of wood as they were still too hot for his hands. Then we listened again, and this time heard the voice quite clearly coming up from the ground. "Baas," said Hans, "it is Sammy in the corn pit." Now I remembered that such a pit existed in front of the huts which, although empty at the time, was, as is common among the Bantu natives, used to preserve corn that would not immediately be needed. Once I myself went through a very tragic experience in one of these pits, as many who may read the history of my first wife, that I have called Marie, can see for themselves. Soon we cleared the place and had lifted the stone, with ventilating holes in it. Well it was for Sammy that those ventilating holes existed, also that the stone did not fit tight. Beneath was a bottle-shaped and cemented structure about 10 feet deep by, say, 8 wide. Instantly through the mouth of this structure appeared the head of Sammy with his mouth wide open like that of a fish gasping for air. We pulled him out, a process that caused him to howl, for the heat had made his skin very tender, and gave him water which one of the Mazitu fetched from a spring. Then I asked him indignantly what he was doing in that hole, while we wasted our tears thinking that he was dead. "Oh, Mr. Quatermain," he said, "I am a victim of too faithful service. To abandon all these valuable possessions of yours to a rapacious enemy was more than I could bear, so I put every one of them in the pit, and then, as I thought I heard someone coming, got in myself and pulled down the stone. But, Mr. Quatermain, soon afterwards the enemy added arson to murder and pillage, and the whole place began to blaze. I could hear the fire roaring above, and a little later the ashes covered the exit so that I could no longer lift the stone, which indeed grew too hot to touch. Here then I sat all night in the most suffocating heat, very much afraid, Mr. Quatermain, lest the 2 kegs of gunpowder that were with me should explode, till at last, just as I had abandoned hope and prepared to die like a tortoise baked alive by a bushman, I heard your welcome voice, and Mr. Quatermain, if there is any soothing ointment to spare I shall be much obliged, for I am scorched all over." "Ah, Sammy, Sammy," I said, "you see what comes of cowardice. On the hill with us you would not have been scorched. It is only by the merest chance of owing to Hans's quick hearing that you were not left to perish miserably in that hole." "That is so, Mr. Quatermain. I plead guilty to the hot impeachment. But on the hill I might have been shot, which is worse than being scorched. Also you gave me charge of your goods, and I determined to preserve them, even at the risk of personal comfort. Lastly, the angel who watches me brought you here in time before I was quite cooked through. So all's well that ends well, Mr. Quatermain, though it is true that for my part I have had enough of bloody war, and if I live to regain civilized regions I propose henceforth to follow the art of food dressing in the safe kitchen of a hotel, that is, if I cannot obtain a berth as an instructor in the English tongue." "Yes," I answered, "all's well that ends well, Sammy my boy, and at any rate you have saved the stores, for which we should be thankful to you. So go along with Mr. Stephen and get doctored while we haul them out of that grain pit." 3 days later we bid farewell to old Bausi, who almost wept at parting with us, and the Mazitu, who were already engaged in the rebuilding of their town. Mavovo and the other Zulus who died in the Battle of the Gate we buried on the ridge opposite to it, raising a mound of earth over them that thereby they might be remembered in generations to come, and laying around them the Mazitu who had fallen in the fight. As we passed that mound on our homeward journey, the Zulus who remained alive, including 2 wounded men who were carried in litters, stopped and saluted solemnly, praising the dead with loud songs. We white people too saluted, but in silence, by raising our hats. By the way, I should add that in this matter also Mavovo's Snake did not lie. He had said that 6 of his company would be killed upon our expedition, and 6 were killed, neither more nor less. After much consulting we determined to take the overland route back to Natal, first because it was always possible that the slave trading fraternity, hearing of their terrible losses, might try to attack us again on the coast, and secondly for the reason that even if they did not, months or perhaps years might pass before we found a ship at Kilwa, then a port of ill repute, to carry us to any civilized place. Moreover, Brother John, who had travelled it, knew the inland road well, and had established friendly relations with the tribes through whose country we must pass, till we reached the borders of Zululand, where I was always welcome. So as the Mazitu furnished us with an escort and plenty of bearers for the first part of the road, and, thanks to Sammy's stewardship in the corn pit, we had ample trade goods left to hire others later on, we made up our minds to risk the longer journey. As it turned out, this was a wise conclusion, since although it took 4 weary months, in the end we accomplished it without any accident whatsoever, if I except a slight attack of fever from which both Miss Hope and I suffered for a while. Also we got some good shooting on the road. My only regret was that this change of plan obliged us to abandon the tusks of ivory we had captured from the slavers and buried where we alone could find them. Still it was a dull time for me, who, for obvious reasons, of which I have already spoken, was literally a 5th wheel to the coach. Hans was an excellent fellow and, as the reader knows, quite a genius in his own way. But night after night in Hans's society began to pall on me at last, while even his conversation about my reverend father, who seemed positively to